Welcome to Lecture 2, The Dawn of the 17th Century, Aristotelian Scholasticism. If we are to understand the nature of the intellectual revolution of the 17th century, we need to understand what the 17th century is revolting against, what its education was. So the purpose of this lecture is to gain an overview of the intellectual inheritance of the 17th century. What is being taught to the educated world? If you were a student entering a European university in the year 1600, what would you learn about the world in which you found yourselves? Every intellectual world asks certain common questions, either explicitly or implicitly. When should I be convinced? What should I find persuasive? When must I say, yes, I have to believe that? At the dawn of the 17th century, the answers were given by a system that dominated quite dramatically and formally the educated world, a system we call Aristotelian Scholasticism. That is to say, the philosophy of Aristotle as interpreted and adopted by the Christian schools of Europe. So Aristotelian because the philosophy of Aristotle, and the fancy term scholasticism now demystified, it dominated the schools of Christian Europe. 17th century Aristotelians often wrote as if Aristotle always had been the central Greek philosopher of the Christian tradition. This was not the case. The process of the Aristotelianization of Christian thought is something that begins in the late 12th, intensifies throughout the 13th century, and comes to dominate the university world from the 14th century on, and then is established quite dramatically as authority throughout the 16th century. The handbooks given to most students entering European universities everywhere in Europe in the 17th century warned them to follow Aristotle and authors who agreed with him and not to depart from the thinking of the Aristotelians. But by the 17th century, the dominant Christian synthesis in theology was that of St. Thomas Aquinas and his disciples and his interpreters, who had utilized Aristotelian philosophical language and conceptualization to explain in natural terms the mysteries and truths of the Christian religion. And once that linkage is made, that the natural philosophy of Aristotle allows one to explain and understand the truths of the Christian faith, the association between Aristotle and Christianity becomes quite profound, and there are a significant number of Aristotelians in the 17th century who argue explicitly that God had sent Aristotle into the world to prepare the human mind for the receipt of the Christian revelation, to give it a philosophical language in which to understand the Christian faith. We can begin to understand the educated Aristotelian scholastic world of the early 17th century by knowing what it thought persuasive and how minds within it won or lost honest arguments. Examinations and the exposition of arguments occurred in a format that was called the disputatio, the disputation. It is a form of argument a presentation of conviction in both sentences, what you believe and what you are going to persuade someone of, and it is at the core of Aristotelian scholastic ways of thinking. The Disputatio emphasized three factors that compelled belief. And starting with the most important, these were authority, reason, and experience. First, of course, there is supernatural authority. If something is given to you by God, it comes from an indubitable source. And the main supernatural authority, of course, is Scripture, but Scripture as correctly understood by appropriate authorities. Then there are natural authorities, and these dominate the education of European minds. And to understand the 17th century's sense of natural intellectual, philosophical authority, one must understand their sense of the presumptive authority of the past. It is of the essence of a traditional society to believe that it possesses things that have stood the test of time. This is how you raise children. This is how you grow crops if you don't want people to starve. This is how you defend a town. This is how you think about the world. These have stood the test of time. They've been examined for centuries or millennia. If there were errors in these authorities, those errors would have been discovered early on or at some point before the present. Now, this is not a wholly foreign way of thinking even today. If you found yourself in an introduction to geometry class, and the teacher said, let's look at Euclid's axioms, and the person seated next to you raised a hand and said, you know, people give so much presumptive authority to Euclid. Most of you would go, oh no, are we going to have to put up with this all semester? Right? For thousands of years, people have looked at Euclid's geometry, and this freshman next to me has seen the flaws. We have our own sense of authorities that have stood the test of time, and not merely in mathematics. I dare say that if in Astronomy 101 or Physics 101, someone presented Kepler's laws of planetary motion, Galileo's laws, Newton's system of gravitation, and the freshman next to you said, you know, there's so much deference given to the presumptive authority of the past. What you would think is, without being at the frontiers of astronomy, you know, if there'd been a flaw in the second law of planetary motion, someone would have found it, not the person seated next to me. Well, it is at the core of the Disputatio that we are the beneficiaries of authorities that have stood the test of time. And these are, above all else, the Greeks and their interpreters. And there is a special added authority to all ancient authors and texts integrated into Christian theology and intellectual life. Thus, for example, the astronomy of Ptolemy is seen to coincide so well with the Christian faith that it adds to its authority. The second aspect of the Disputatio is reason. From the Greeks on, there is a certain Western compact with reason. We are rational beings. If someone says to you, 2 times 6 gives you 12, and you say, yes, I know that, and a bit later someone says 2 times 6 gives you 14, something in you says, because you are heirs of that rational tradition, you can't contradict yourself. Something can't be both A and not A. If I show that thought leads to a logical contradiction, I have invalidated it. The West has simply believed we are not wild beasts when it comes to the mind. We are disciplined. We will not contradict ourselves. But there are 2 primary modes of reason as the West thinks about it. One is induction. Induction is drawing general truths from a large set of particulars, from a large number of particular pieces of data. One infers, one induces a general theory, a generalization that is true of all that data. The second is deduction. Deductive logic is one begins with something known to be true, and one logically deduces from it other truths that follow. Just think back to the way you had to prove things in geometry, and you have a perfect case of deductive logic. What follows from certain axioms and premises being true? Well, if we can begin all of our reasoning from received authorities who give us principles known to be true, then the appropriate model to the practice in the early 17th century, and the reason that is there in the Disputatio, is deductive reason, deriving what follows logically from things that are known by authority. The third and least important part of the Disputatio is experience, which is not an inductive logic, a learning from the particulars of nature what is true in general, nor a systematic means of inquiry, but above all an illustration of things known by authority and logical deduction. Once you know something to be true, from a deduction by Euclid, you can give an example of it in the world, an illustration. And indeed, many professors in the sciences today at our universities, rather than leading students through the inductive experiments that led to something being deemed true in chemistry or astronomy, will merely illustrate what they already know to be true. And the function of experience in the Disputatio is to illustrate things known to be true by authority and logical deduction from authority. And there is the added burden that one should be able to account for the phenomena, that what one has shown to be true should account for the world as we observe it. And indeed, it will be the difficulty of the received astronomy to account for the phenomena known increasingly to the 17th century that will open one of the major avenues of criticism of the received system of knowledge. The Aristotelian accomplishment is quite extraordinary. In the minds of Europe, Aristotle had taken a world that seemed to us kaleidoscopic, without order, random, without interrelationship, and reduced it to coherence, found system, made sense of it, found order in it. And central to that was the Aristotelian system of causality that gave to Europeans an understanding of how and why what things happen and what those things are. There are four components to the Aristotelian system of causality. Let me list them and we'll go through them. Material cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and final cause. Aristotle asks, in effect, what has to be in order for the world to be as we observe it? And one obvious answer is there must be something from which the particular things of the world are made. If we want to give an explanation of a marble statue of Alexander the Great, there must be marble. If there were not marble, if there were nothing that could hold a shape, if there were only liquids or gases, there couldn't be statues. The material cause tells you what is the stuff of which something is made. In the case of our marble statue of Alexander the Great, the material cause is the marble of the statue. And now note, that marble is a set of potentials, a set of possibilities, a set of powers to be, potentials. But though that block of marble could have been made into thousands and thousands of things, it was made into something very special, a statue. So there must be, in addition to the stuff of which something is made, a form that that stuff takes, a form that is actualized, realized out of the set of possibilities of that block of marble. And the particular form, the statue of Alexander the Great, is the being actualized from the stuff of the material cause, the marble. We can talk about human souls this way as well. In order for there to be a soul, there must be spirit, something incorporeal, non-bodily. But spirit can be many things. Among other things, angel, devil, there are incorporeal things. One possibility of spiritual substance, of incorporeal substance, is realized in a human soul. And what gives it that particular form is its formal cause. Demons and the devil are ineluctably moved toward evil. Angels are ineluctably moved toward the good. The human soul is that spirit which is free to choose between good and evil. That is its formal cause. Its material cause is its spirit, its substance. Now, we could have that block of marble, and there could be the possibility of the form of a statue, but nothing happens. Something must actualize the form. Something must actually bring that form into being. In this case, the sculptor with his hammer and chisel. Without the sculptor and his hammer and chisel, the efficient cause, the form, the marble statue of Alexander the Great, could not be actualized from the substance, the matter, which is marble. Now, to understand the wonderful fit of an Aristotelian worldview in which nature is seen as purposeful, and a Christian worldview in which God does everything with a reason, we need to understand final cause, the reason or purpose of the action, the sculptor, the hammer and chisel, the marble, and the possibility of the form of the statue of Alexander the Great. All of those are there if the sculptor does not have a reason to act, an end in mind. That's why final cause, an end in mind, a purpose, a goal. The marble statue of Alexander the Great never is brought into being, never is actualized from those potentials of marble. And given that we are talking about, for Christian Europe, a universe created by an infinitely powerful supreme being, the study of final causes, the name of which is the science of teleology, from telos, purpose, end. The science of teleology asks, what is the end served, the purpose of something being brought into being under the plan of God? So Aristotelian scholastic understanding wishes to know the stuff from which something is made. That's important. Something bodily or spiritual. That tells you a lot about its value, its nature. What form? Think of the difference between having gold and choosing to make an assassin's dagger or a cross, right? Form matters. Spirit is an extraordinary substance, but what a difference between saint and sinner. Form matters. Efficient cause was something made by a human being or by God. What a striking difference we have in our knowledge and what is the purpose, the end served. What does teleology teach us? In distinguishing among material causes and formal causes, there are operating principles in Aristotelian scholasticism that allows us to distinguish among the essences brought into beings in the form, because we have a scale of perfection. We know what is perfect. God is perfect. And those qualities shared with God, love, spirit, not body, wisdom, those things shared with God are more valuable. The Aristotelian scholastic thinks in terms of the perfections inherent in any material cause and formal cause. One way to think of perfection as something that exists is imagine light in a room with a dimmer. The real perfection, the real quality, the positive thing is the light. There's no such thing as darkness as a real thing. It's the absence of light. You turn the dimmer, you diminish the light. Sound is the real thing. You turn down the volume and you get to silence. Well, we have the qualities of God, and we have the things that God has created, and we have their absences. And that gives us a scale of being on which we may place everything in the world by how close it is to the qualities of God and whether it has more or less of positive things. So, for example, God is immutable, unchangeable. The immutable is higher and more important than the mutable. We know that. So the Aristotelian scholastic looks out at the heavens, they're unchanging. Looks out on earth, and everything changes. And it tells you a truly great mind should think about immutable things, God, or at least the heavens, astronomy. But what kind of person would think about crops or rocks? You have a goal of contemplative understanding and appreciation of the perfections and purposes of things. From teleology, we know that under God's design, all things strive for God's order, for the fulfillment of his purposes. The world is a great chain of being, a hierarchy of perfections. Given the mutable things of the earth and the immutable things of the heavens, there is a fundamental divide between the sublunar world beneath the moon and celestial beings and phenomena. And there is an essential hierarchy of souls that govern things. God is all perfection actualized. Angels less so, pure intellect, incorporeal, but imperfect. Hence the phrase, man is but little lower than the angels. Now you understand where that comes from. We have a reasoning soul, but a corporeal body. We have free will to choose between good and evil. Beneath us, the animals. They have senses and non-rational learning, but no freedom of the will. Beneath them, the plants. They're capable of purposeful growth, but no reproduction, no learning, no choice. Then there are stones, holy body and lacking soul in its behaviors, at infinite remove from God. Why did God create both angels and stones? St. Thomas Aquinas said, his love was infinite, and he brought all things into being. Now, what follows from being educated in such a system? What should a mind capable of study and reflection know? First, obviously, it should have deep knowledge of the system as a whole and its lessons. For example, there is the dramatic lesson, if you understand the chain of being, that human beings can follow their body and fall further from the immutable perfection of God to the basest center of earth, the location of hell, or escape their body and rise to the immutable celestial heavens. It's built into the system, and one should know the system as a whole and its implications for the meaning of life. Two, a mind should have knowledge of perfections and purposes. Above all, contemplative classification. One is not going to change the order of the world, yielding wisdom of God's creation and of our place within it. And the mind, above all, should dwell on higher, not lower things. What we think of as the sciences of the modern era, with the exception of astronomy, would all be the study of the baser and lower things. This profound underlying conceptual system directs people to a sense of what a deep mind should know. This Aristotelian scholasticism is the system that had emerged officially triumphant after all of the intellectual wars of the Renaissance and the 16th century. And it is enshrined in the official curriculums of the secondary schools and the universities of Western Europe. And with Francis Bacon, the subject of our next lecture, will begin the momentous assault on the predominance of this system of thought. And in many ways, the intellectual revolution of the 17th century writ large. A reordering of the categories of the disputation, displacing the presumptive authority of the past, moving from deductive to inductive reasoning once stripped of authorities, and the dramatic revaluation of the role of experience in human knowledge, the overturning of the presumptive authority of the past will be one of the most profound developments in the entire history of the West, and for any revolution will depend upon it, the separation of natural philosophy, the study of the natural world, from theology as two separate spheres. That project will strike at the heart of the Aristotelian scholastic synthesis. Thank you very much.